After Hamas' attack on October 7th, Israel entered Gaza in what many believe is a losing war. What began as a campaign to destroy Hamas and free hostages has turned into an endless cycle of mass punishment and displacement. In the past few months, the Middle East has been turned upside down, bringing significant turmoil to the region. Across the world, Israel finds itself increasingly isolated, with 153 countries voting for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and a majority of Americans supporting an end to the violence. This round of conflict has highlighted deep-rooted issues within Israel over the past 76 years, casting doubts on its future. Much of this can be traced back to how Palestinians have been systematically treated and denied their rights. But how did a country born after the Holocaust end up being accused of similar crimes against the Palestinians? And how did Israel's political elite lead both Israel and the US to become the biggest losers in this conflict? Welcome to Inside Story. To understand October 7th, we need to go back to the roots of this conflict. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was established. For Palestinians, this event is known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. During this period, more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes. Multiple massacres targeting Arabs occurred, and hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed. These refugees fled to camps in neighboring areas. Today, their descendants, numbering around 7 million, remain refugees. Fast forward to 1967, the six-day war between Israel and neighboring Arab states resulted in Israel occupying Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights in Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Approximately 300,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from the West Bank during this conflict. Israel's borders expanded, and it now controlled both Arabs and Jews within these new territories. Unlike the Palestinians who stayed behind in 1948, those in the newly occupied territories were not granted Israeli citizenship. From 1967 to today, Israel has maintained military occupation over the West Bank and has controlled Gaza from afar since 2005, imposing military law and denying Palestinians civil rights enjoyed by the rest of Israel's population. In 1993, a glimmer of hope came when the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, reached a deal with the Israeli government known as the Oslo Accords. Under these agreements, both parties recognized each other and agreed on an interim period where a Palestinian Authority would assume some self-governance in Gaza and parts of the West Bank. Oslo was meant to be the start of a peace process to resolve the decades-long conflict. Palestinians believed this would lead to an independent Palestinian state. For Israel, it primarily meant an end to the First Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, and offloading security responsibilities to the Palestinian Authority. As promising as these peace agreements were, the subsequent events explain why this conflict has persisted to this day, leading to events like we are seeing since October 7th.
Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the architect of the Middle East peace process, has been assassinated.
Truly shocking news from the Middle East tonight. Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been assassinated.
Evening spent dreaming of peace turns into a national nightmare.
After the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the right-wing Likud party returned to power in 1996 under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. His tenure marked a significant escalation in Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and the peace process. Netanyahu oversaw the gradual dismantling of the Oslo Accords. He argued that these accords were incompatible with the historical right of the Jewish people to the entire land west of the Jordan River. To understand Netanyahu's policies, it's important to know about his father, Benzion Netanyahu, who was an activist and leader in the revisionist Zionism movement. This ideology advocates for a greater Israel and views Arabs as perpetual enemies that must be transferred out. Netanyahu's father strongly advocated against two-state solution and the Palestinians as a nation. This belief has deeply influenced his son's relentless mission to prevent the establishment of an independent Palestinian state.
Benjamin Netanyahu saying on Thursday that Israel must have security control over all land west of the Jordan River, which would include the territory of any possible future Palestinian state.
One of the most destructive policies under Netanyahu's leadership has been the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Despite international law, the number of settlers increased from around 115,000 in 1993 to over 750,000 in 2024. More than 250 settlements and outposts now divide the West Bank. These settlements often involve the confiscation of Palestinian land, displacing communities and leading to repeated aggression by armed settlers and the Israeli army. For Palestinians, the Oslo Accords represented a land for peace deal that could give them self-determination and a state of their own. This vision could have been realized if Israel had allowed it, potentially preventing the current situation. However, Israel continued its policy of stripping Palestinians of their land by expanding settlements. This eventually contributed to the collapse of these agreements and for a renewed violence, leading to the tragic events since October 7, 2023. Netanyahu's policies have left Israel more vulnerable, with increasing international criticism and internal unrest. The situation today is a direct result of decades of policy decisions that have failed to bring peace and security to the region. This unsustainable situation is causing serious problems for Israel. The first one is related to demographics. In recent years, there has been a rough demographic parity of Arabs and Jews between the river and the sea. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis left the country after October 7th, and many don't intend to return, highlighting Israel's demographic challenges. It's evident that Israel could lose the demographic battle unless it finds a way to address the Palestinian problem, which some believe it might be attempting now. Another major problem is Israel's potential status as an apartheid state, echoing the history of South Africa. Leading human rights groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem describe Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank as apartheid. All three organizations agree that Israel is enforcing a system of oppression and discrimination, which dispossess Palestinians of their properties and strictly restrict their movements. For Israeli politicians, the only way out is to keep moving forward. This is why the goal of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his far-right coalition is to expel all Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, creating an Israel largely free of Palestinians. This move would end Israel's apartheid label and fulfill the dreams of a greater Israel. Evidence of this can be seen in Israel's conduct in Gaza during the war. To drive people out, many must be killed. So far, over 35,000 have been killed in Gaza, causing many others to flee. Israel's strategy includes making Gaza uninhabitable by targeting infrastructure, universities, hospitals, and bakeries. However, this plan is not working. Despite months of devastating attacks and imposed starvation, many Palestinians refuse to leave northern Gaza. This leaves Israel back at square one, facing an unachievable endgame and unable to deal with its fundamental problems. Israel is unable to defeat Hamas or drive out the Palestinians. The United States understands this and has been warning Israel of a strategic defeat.
You see, in this kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat.
Israel's third problem is the wider regional conflict. The first major regional threat comes from the north, where it faces Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a formidable enemy, armed with an estimated 150,000 missiles and rockets, and it's Iran's most powerful Shia proxy in the region. Since the war in Gaza began, Hezbollah and Israel have been exchanging attacks and shelling. The clashes in the north have been escalating rapidly, and Israel faces limited options for dealing with Hezbollah. To the south, in Yemen, the Houthis, another Shia proxy of Iran, have been launching long-range missiles and drones at Israel for months. With Iran's support, they have targeted ships in the Red Sea heading for Israel. These situations in the north and the south highlight how difficult it is for Israel to secure a victory. The most significant regional threat to Israel is Iran itself. After Israel killed top Iranian generals in a building attached to Iran's embassy in Damascus, Iran fired ballistic missiles and drones at Israel for the first time. Iran and Israel are vying for control over the region. The U.S. has no interest in seeing these two nations clash, but the war in Gaza has stripped Israel of its most critical weapon, deterrence. Israel's long-held image of invincibility has been shattered, a major strategic failure. The recent months have seen Iran take control of the level of escalation, with Israel moving to a reactive position. Israel's limited ability to wage war without the unconditional support of the United States is its fourth major problem. Israel is a small country with limited resources. Most of its previous wars ended quickly. Prolonged fighting and multi-dimensional threats are exposing its vulnerabilities. The U.S. has deployed aircraft carriers to the region, provided Israel with endless bombs and missiles for the attack on Gaza, and actively shot down many of the Iranian missiles and drones. Israel, in many ways, is becoming a strategic liability to the US. Hamas and Israel's enemies understand this very well, and it's part of their strategy. Israel also faces significant internal troubles. Up to 100,000 Israelis had to leave the north and the south to the central area. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been drafted into the army to fight in Gaza. This is hurting Israel's economy, costing up to $600 million a week on top of the war costs. Protests against the government in Tel Aviv, which started before the war, have continued, highlighting the deep divide in the country. The many challenges Israel faces, from regional threats to internal strife, highlight the complexity of its situation. Israel has returned to Gaza after leaving in 2005, but it is not winning. Israeli soldiers are losing their lives, and there is no clear plan for Gaza other than trying to drive the Palestinians out. Despite making the area unlivable, the Palestinians are not leaving. Regionally, Israel has lost the dominance it once had. It can no longer deter its enemies. Globally, Israel's standing is extremely challenged, facing accusations of genocide and its leaders facing arrest warrants. Most importantly, Israel has lost the narrative war, which it has invested in for decades. Global protests in support of Palestinians are on the rise, and younger generations are increasingly sympathetic with the Palestinian cause. Many of the justifications for Israel's actions are no longer acceptable. Israel is facing a real existential problems. Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is coming back to haunt them. For the US, the last thing it wants is another conflict in the Middle East. Israel's actions are extremely disruptive to the pressing issues the US is facing in East Asia with China and in Europe with Russia. The US is now pinned down in the Middle East, unable to exert enough pressure on Israel to steer the war back to the calm before October 7th. You can see now how a small group of armed fighters called Hamas has managed to outplay Israel. Not because Hamas has significant power or resources, but because of Israel's intrinsic flaws. For Hamas, they have nothing more to lose, but for Israel, this war could be the beginning of the end. Thank you for watching this episode of Inside Story. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.